Okay, well, first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the very first ICArEHB Dialogues event of the 2023-2024 season. I'm Dr. Sarah Rhodes and your host this afternoon. I'm a researcher at the Interdisciplinary Center for Archaeology and the Evolution of Human Behavior at the University of Algarve in beautiful Faro, Portugal. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by our three expert speakers. Firstly, we have our own Ceren Kabukcu, who is an archaeobotanist and researcher at ICArEHB, working primarily with carbonized plant remains. She studies prehistoric plant food and past reliance on woodland resources in Southwest Asia and Mediterranean Europe. And to name just a few of her collaborations, she currently works at the Paleolithic site of Shannon Dar Cave in northern Iraq, the early Neolithic site of Karahan Tepe in southeast Turkey, and is a core member of the last hunter-gatherers of the Eastern Fertile Crescent project funded by the Gerda Henkel Stiftung. She also works on the transition to farming and crop domestication, and at some of the earliest sites with evidence for settled life and agricultural practices. Dr. Kabukcu was awarded her PhD from the University of Liverpool in 2015, and before joining ICArEHB, she was a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow and a Gerda Henkel Stiftung Research Associate. Thank you for joining us today, Ceren. We also have the director of the IBS Center for Climate Physics, Professor Axel Timmermann, here today. Professor Timmermann completed his doctoral research at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg, Germany, after which he held positions at the University of Kiel and the University of Hawaii, where he was promoted to full professor in 2009. Since 2017, Professor Timmermann has been the director of the ICCP at Pusan National University, where he holds a distinguished professorship as well. In addition to the number of awards that Professor Timmermann has received over his career, which include the Rosenstiel Award for Oceanographic Sciences and the Milankovitch Medal from the European Geosciences Union, Professor Timmermann was recently awarded Scientist of the Year by the Korean Science Journalists Association for his work communicating climate science to the general public. And here he is doing so again. Thank you for joining us, Axel.
Thank you, Sarah.
And we have Professor Kate Britton of the University of Aberdeen here as well. Professor Britton is a bioarchaeologist specializing in prehistory and paleodietary reconstructions. She studied at the University of Reading and Durham University before joining Max Planck Institute for Environmental Anthropology in Leipzig, initially as a doctoral candidate and then as a postdoctoral research scientist and DAAD Junior Scholarship holder. Professor Britton was appointed lecturer in archaeological sciences at the University of Aberdeen in 2010. She became head of the department in 2020 and was promoted to full professor in 2021. She's been awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize in Archaeology, and earlier this year, Professor Britton was awarded a UK Frontier and Innovation Research Grant of 5 years to support her successful European Research Council Consolidator project, PaleoScot, People, Animals, Landscapes, and Environments in Late Glacial Scotland. Congratulations, Professor Britton, and thank you for being here today. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone in the audience that they can post questions to our experts via the YouTube chat function at any time during the session, and as many questions as we can possibly answer will be answered during the Q&A section at the end. Now, let's get started with the basics. What do we mean when we say climate change? Axel, do you want to get us started?
Climate change is, of course, a very big word, but it's also pretty meaningless because the climate has been changing.
Sorry, Axel, I'm not sure your mic's on.
My mic is on. Can you hear me? My mic is on.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so climate change is, of course, a very big word, but it's also rather meaningless because the climate has been changing for billions of years on our planet. But so we have to be a little bit more specific. The word climate change became very popular under the George W. Bush administration because they tried to avoid the word global warming. But let me just go a little bit more into the semantics here. First of all, weather is very important. Weather changes our daily behavior. and we know it fluctuates on timescales of days to weeks. If we talk about the climate system, we think much more about longer-term variations. For instance, the El Nino phenomenon, changes in the temperature in the eastern equatorial Pacific every once in a while, some years hot, some years cold, or the North Atlantic Oscillation. So the climate itself describes something that is associated with fluctuations on timescales of months to hundreds and thousands of years or millions of years. Okay, so what we have now is that this is so-called internal climate variability, and it emerges as the interaction between the atmosphere, the ocean, the cryosphere, and the biosphere. And these interactions themselves can create variability. We call this natural climate variability. And now, with the external forcings, such as, for instance, astronomical forcings, Milankovitch cycles are very important, of course, for archaeologists. They change the climate on longer timescales of tens of thousands of years. So they can shift the weather patterns and climate patterns on in our climate system, and that's what we call externally forced climate change. And the most important driver, of course, of the last 50 and 100 years of the climate system has been the humans. We have changed our climate, global mean temperature, rainfall patterns worldwide, by introducing several chemical compounds, and the most notable one is, of course, CO2. So CO2 emissions have changed our planet, and this is external forcings, and so they shift the natural variability in our climate system while also driving additional warming on our planet. So this is kind of the climate change concept in a nutshell. Everything changes, but we have to specify whether we are talking about internal variability, external variability, whether we are talking about astronomical forcings or anthropogenic forcings. So CO2 emissions have changed.
Sorry. Okay, next slide.
And so on this slide, we are seeing the global mean temperature reconstructed over the last 2,000 years. This has been obtained by using so-called paleoproxy data. Of course, the thermometer was only invented a few hundred years ago. So in order to reconstruct climate back in time, we can use, for instance, tree rings, ice cores, and I will talk about it maybe later on. What we see very clearly is that over the last 2,000 years, we see the natural variations in the climate system, an overall cooling towards the Little Ice Age around 1600 CE. But then as the Industrial Revolution started, we have this massive warming, and that one we can really attribute to human activities. So this is really anthropogenic part, the externally forced climate change. Greenhouse warming is the correct word. Everything before is actually internally generated, or some volcanic eruptions and maybe also some solar forcing contributed to some of these spikes. But we're seeing the natural range of climate variability and the perturbation that is introduced by our human activities. Global warming, greenhouse warming, warmed our planet already by 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So this is really something that we can attribute to the greenhouse gas effect.
Okay, thank you for that. Ceren, maybe you can give us the archaeologist perspective.
Thanks, because it's a tough question, and I am going to just sidestep it slightly. So myself and most archaeologists, or rather environmental archaeologists, don't work directly on depicting climate change or understanding and demonstrating how it happened, etc. But we work with proxies, so things that may reflect some of the long-term climatic shifts. So we may work with chemical values in plants, animals, or human remains that may demonstrate some of these shifts that are a result of broader environmental and climatic changes. But more commonly, we look at the residues from people's daily lives. And most of the rubbish they accumulate in different places they live in. So we work through past rubbish deposits to find out what could help us to understand and reconstruct these past environments. And we have to look at them in totality. Through these, we may be able to infer climatic conditions. So these include identifying the plants and animals that are used by groups in the past, which might sometimes give us an understanding of their different locations they used in the landscape. For example, we can reconstruct the diversity and composition of wetland environments close to some archaeological habitations. And in some cases, we can look at change or stability in these ecosystems through time. The great difficulty that we face as environmental archaeologists is some of these changes can be in response to changes in climatic variables or impacts that result from humans and animals that are living and inhabiting these landscapes. For many archaeologists who work on the material residues and skeletal remains from past habitation sites, one of our challenges is to unpick this closely connected feedbacks between the climatic conditions, the environments and the microecologies and the habitats that people live in, and the actual people who use and impact these resources. This makes what we do and the perspective we can offer on past climate and environmental change both challenging, but rewarding at the same time, because we are able to see, in some cases, the totality of the human experience in changing environments and how they may or may not respond.
I love that, the totality of human experience in changing environments. Kate, can you build on that or add to that, perhaps?
Well, that's a lot of great information. And I, with regards to what Axel said, I do think it's really, really useful to differentiate between climate change from that anthropogenically induced climate change or global warming that we're seeing today, because I think there's a lot of confusion around these terms. But as Axel pointed out, the climate is always changing, and that has been a feature throughout the Quaternary period. So that's the sort of last 2.5 million years or so. But importantly, that's the period in which our species has evolved and spread all around the world. From my perspective as an archaeologist, I'm with Ceren in the sense that, as she's highlighted, we tend to study past environments and human responses to those changes rather than necessarily just sort of reconstruct temperatures, although sometimes we do that a little bit. So we tend to reconstruct environments rather than climates, and also think about how human societies interacted with or adapted to those changes from that more kind of holistic angle. And for me, I think we have to remember, and in my own line of research, we have to remember those environmental changes refer to a lot of different things. So the changes in rainfall, vegetation, but also the spread and biogeographical range of different animal species. And when we're dealing with the deeper human past prior to agriculture, those things would have been really important. And of course, that backdrop, if you like, so those climatic changes, those environmental changes, they would influence the archaeology that we find and how the people would have interacted with those environments and made their livelihoods. So that it's really important for us when we're making our interpretations about the past. And this image is just to kind of typify that. So it shows the same site, a site that's somewhere nested behind those trees on the right, in two different phases: a cool phase towards the end of a late glacial period, so towards the end of the late Pleistocene, so perhaps 18 or 16,000 years ago, and then into the early Holocene, so the more recent warmer phase that we're still in now. And you can see that the vegetation is different. One, we've got snow cover, we've got wolves, we've got reindeer, and in the second one we've got trees, we've got red deer, or we might have things like wild boar in this kind of scene. And the humans that would be occupying this landscape and making their way in this world would be interacting with a very different scene. I think we also have to remember, as well as a backdrop to all of this, is that climate shifts seasonally. And I know Axel said a little bit about that too, that yes, there are seasonal shifts, there are annual shifts, as well as these broad scale climate shifts that many of us think about, and that those would interact with local human behaviors and actions. And so we have to remember that when we study people and their environments in the past, we have to remember that those landscapes they were occupying were dynamic and changeable. I like to think of these as living landscapes, including the plants and the animals, and that was the arena in which that human action was occurring.
Living landscapes. I like that, because I think we often think of the environment as just the backdrop, but you're right, it is a very active player. Okay, thank you guys. Now that we've decided what climate change is, let's focus a bit more on the past. What is the #1 climate change issue that the study of the past can help us address? Axel, do you want to start us as the non-archaeologist of the group? What do you think is our #1 question?
I think the past really helps us also learn something about the future. So this is very general, of course. But of course, if we want to understand our future trajectory, how humans are changing the environment, how humans are changing temperatures, rainfall patterns, sea level on our planet, we really need to go back into the past, take our little time machine in order to really understand the context also. And it's not only about humans, but we also, as Kate just mentioned, we also need to understand how animals and vegetation changed in the past, because they adapted to a certain climatic envelope. And that climatic envelope was partly provided by changes in the climate system that occurred on timescales of millennia and longer. So in order to really see the natural climatic niche of fauna and flora, in order to be able to understand what the sensitivity of that climatic niche will be with respect to future climate change, greenhouse warming to be precise, we really need to go back and go into our time machine. Maybe you can go a slide back, Sarah. Okay, and how does a time machine look like? Not very sophisticated. There are different ones. We can take sediment cores from lakes, for instance, or from the marine realm, so going into the ocean, taking sediment cores from the ocean. Sometimes they are several hundred meters even long. And by going through the growth, by going through the chemical composition, by looking at some fossils, very often fossil plankton, in these cores, we can learn something about the past environments. On the left-hand side of this image, you can see two of my team members recently, 6 weeks ago in Botswana, where we went to a cave system, a rather unique cave system. And there we took cores actually from stalagmites. And we hope to reconstruct past climate of the last 200 to 300,000 years for this area in southern Africa. And what do? We analyze these cores with respect to certain isotopes, oxygen and carbon isotopes. We can look at the trace elements. And the amazing thing is there is even a little bit of water still stored in the calcite crystals. So it's paleo rain. In that regard, we are really going back in time. And that paleo rain we can also analyze in order to understand how much did it rain, how was the atmospheric circulation like back then. And going back 200 to 300,000 years ago, of course, brings us also to the advent of our own species, Homo sapiens. So there is a very nice way how analyzing past climate archives can also help to set the stage, set the context for our own human evolution. And if we look at this slide here, which shows the, it's not reconstructed, it's actually simulated, global mean temperature change over the last 3 million years, you can see many interesting things. You can see this gradual cooling trend, which is due to the fact that mostly the CO2 actually also decreased from the early Pleistocene into the late Pleistocene. And then there is a break in that figure, which indicates kind of our present pre-industrial condition. Then you can see all the way to 2000, this is the observed record. And from there on, we can see the projected temperatures, assuming certain CO2 emission scenarios. And this is, of course, we don't know how politicians will react over the next 20, 30 years. Whether we are going for business as usual or whether we are really able to cut down CO2 emissions and become carbon neutral. So these are the different scenarios that you're seeing. But one thing is amazing in that figure and scary, the fact that our current temperature, if you look at 2000, is already warmer than anything that occurred in the last 2.5 million years. So we have really left the envelope, the climatic envelope of the last 2 million years. And this is important for understanding how life will respond also into the future. So setting the stage from the past really helps us to see how far are we moving out of that natural range of variations.
And we definitely are moving out of that natural range, as that chart shows. Thank you, Axel. Ceren, could you maybe bring it back to what archaeologists can tell us about how people survived in this envelope?
Right. So I completely agree. I think setting things in the past and providing a point of reference is incredibly important. And for me, one of the, I guess, the number one thing, and this, I'm biased because I study past plants, is what are we going to do about feeding a growing planet in the face of all this scary climate change that's coming our way, and what we're already experiencing. So I feel like our field, but even cognate fields in ecology, in climatology, can help us to grapple with what to do in the face of not just surviving, but thriving in the future. And I think archaeology offers us a way to question our actions today. So research on past farming systems can provide a lot of examples of resilient behaviors and responses to crises. And what are some of the things that we learn? We learned that across many regions and several periods in prehistory and later periods of farming, modification of the environment included a much greater diversity of plants than we focus on through industrial and large-scale farming today, and what the globalized economy has come to rely on. To just demonstrate to you what I mean, only 15 crop species today provide nearly 90% of global population's energy intake. Compared to this, Neolithic agriculture in just Anatolia, and I just give you one example, which is Anatolia is present-day Turkey, well, some of it anyway, comprised a much greater diversity of cereals and pulses as crops, as well as oil crops, and various groups continuously collected wild fruits and nuts from woodlands. They managed not just for food, but fuelwood and other subsistence needs. This kind of practice is not necessarily unique to prehistory or to that one region. So what is termed traditional agriculture or traditional ecological knowledge systems often rely on a much greater diversity of crops and much greater diversity in the forms, shapes, colors, and tastes, even within these species. This makes farming and management of landscape much easier to adapt to any future risks, and some of which may arise from climate change. It also improves our health and nutrition. So a simple example is this diversity of plants included in the diet and greater reliance on wild plant resources improves, I guess, one of the things that has become very fashionable to talk about today, gut health. The level of diversity in ways of farming and managing landscapes and the crops themselves, as well as these wild plants, are as much a part of our tangible heritage as big monuments or famous sculptures. If we are to face a sustainable future in the face of climate change, then we need to protect not just our biological heritage, as well as the intangible elements of it. So through archaeology and other means, different ways of farming and different ways of cooking or existing in the environment. So to this, I feel like archaeology can offer a lot through empirical evidence and by opening dialogues like this one that can question our present existence.
Okay, Kate, you were nodding along like crazy through that. Do you want to add to that?
And I think that's fabulous. I think what you're saying, Ceren, about sort of learning lessons from the past in terms of not only sustainable management practices, but even our own health is really pertinent here. I guess another area in which there may be some potential to quite literally learn from the past is by using archaeological data to create predictive models for future outcomes. So the sorts of things that that Axel has been talking about, leaving at that envelope, seeing what could potentially happen with certain aspects of that envelope by learning from the past. So, for example, in recent years, I have been working on developing analytical methods for reconstructing past animal migrations using something called strontium isotope analysis. I won't go into it in too much depth, but essentially we're looking at the chemistry of the teeth of animals to reconstruct their migratory habits. And we can do this. We've tested these methods with modern animals, and we can now apply them to the past. And through that process, we've been working really closely with modern caribou ecologists in developing these techniques, testing those techniques, as I said, on modern materials, so skeletal materials from modern caribou of known herd migration patterns that have undergone culling as part of their management for reasons unrelated to the studies, but using those materials to test the techniques we wish to apply to the past. And together, we've spent a lot of time discussing the predictive possibilities of these kinds of data sets. So the caribou ecologists I've been working with are very excited that we could use these to look at perhaps how caribou or reindeer, as we know them in the European record, may have changed their behaviors with climate change. So just how plastic their behavior could be in the face of quite drastic climate change, and whether they can help us anticipate how the migrations of modern caribou might change with contemporary climate change. I think it's very exciting theoretically. I think, as Axel said, the fact that we're kind of really leaving our natural envelope is obviously kind of problematic in the sense that there may be no analog in the past that we can look for. And equally, I think the science, at least in that kind of predictive modeling, is really in its infancy. But I do think there is another way that archaeology could maybe be, could help tackle climate change that's a little bit more subtle. And this is something I've written a little bit about with one of my colleagues here in Aberdeen, Charlotta. So, and hear me out on this. So one of the known barriers to climate change action, so that's things like using your car a bit less or recycling a bit more, is almost feeling distance from climate change, like it's something that's happening to other people and in other worlds and isn't real. And I think this is really common amongst many of us here in the UK or in Portugal and other countries where we're not really seeing the drastic effects of climate change. And in a sense, even if we are seeing things, so for example, increased flooding, we are socially, politically, economically insulated from the really bad effects. But one of the things that we do in archaeology, so one of the gaps we need to bridge is how do we overcome those barriers to climate change action for people who aren't being impacted, for want of a better way of phrasing it, even though they are. I think one of the things we do in archaeology is we tell stories. We tell interesting stories, evocative stories about the past, about people, and the way that people in the past coped with climate change. And I think that these stories can have the power to somehow bridge a little bit of that distance, to make the wiggles on a ice core data graph real and human and maybe a little bit more relatable for most people. And perhaps that's a tiny bit that archaeology can do to help.
That's a really lovely idea. And I think, unfortunately, we're all going to start feeling climate change in the near future, although you're correct to different degrees. So let's move a little bit off of that topic and answer a question that I get quite a bit from the general public. Is it in our nature to change our environment? Are we just being humans when we make changes to our environment? Ceren, since you've worked so closely with farmers and that sort of time period, what do you think about this question?
All right, so I guess, can you hear me okay? Yeah. We're going to spend a whole time talking about plants when it comes to my slots. Sorry. I am biased, I know. Right, so I talked about farming previously, and I'll shift to talking about woodlands now. I guess it is in our nature to shape the environments that we live in. Not always intentional, but there are some cases where it's intentional, and woodland management is one of those cases. So I'll take this opportunity to talk to you all about shaping trees and woodlands and landscapes. So we know through research into this topic in prehistory that it starts with more or less in settlements that faced a need for steady levels of supplies. So more fuel to burn, more timber to use in buildings, or wood to be used in crafts activities. These are broad issues that we can relate to today. So some recent innovations have been driven by our needs to have access to steady resources like food at constant levels. So woodland management at its inception, we think, represents a shift in the way the environment was modified. So there are other forms of modifying the environment, but woodland management per se targets very specific growth forms and is what enables the production of things like charcoal in kilns, but they require generations of input. We're not talking about shaping an environment just overnight, like or well, in 1 year, like gardening. We're talking about generations being involved, trees being cut on cycles, certain taxa or species being protected. So there's a strategy that transcends individuals or small groups. It is long-term and collective, and when successfully implemented, they can make marginal environments. Some of the trees that I'm showing you here come from such marginal environments in semi-arid inland Anatolia that gets barely enough rainfall for dry farming. It makes these kinds of marginal environments far more productive. And we know many examples from prehistory as well as later periods and from a huge diversity of environments. So some of the oak trees that I showed you previously comes from this woodland catchment in central Anatolia. And as long as human groups had permanent or more or less year-round settlements, they probably engaged in this kind of shaping and changing the environments. To the people who are engaged in this kind of woodland management or environmental modification, the signs on the trees themselves and the big woodlands are clear. People have been here, they have been investing in protecting this kind of environment, and at the same time, they continue using it. I also have examples in this final one from completely different environments. So these are not from my study regions, but they represent equally long-term common practices that are very similar to what we see in semi-arid or arid environments and are intrinsically linked to the management and sustainability of these resources. So what we see as a tree is a resource that is long-lasting and can be used and regenerate when cut. And it often incorporates, as in this lovely picture with some of the Scottish crows as well, animal husbandry and pastoralist activities. So there's an indication that this kind of practice that we know from archaeology to be long-lasting and very common may be considered to be in our nature, and we can learn these kinds of practices and keep them enduring into historical periods and even today. So yes, I guess it can be in our nature if we want to.
That's really interesting. I love the idea of trees signifying past people, modifying that living landscape as well. Kate, what do you think about this idea? Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think they're just such lovely examples of those modifications that that humans can make to their environments. I think, and I agree, I think those changes may not always be intentional, but often are the outcomes of human behavior, although obviously many of those examples were intentional. I mean, for me, I have to say, I think that there is something fundamentally very human about changing our environments in the very broadest sense. This image here, everything in this image that surrounds these Neanderthals. So another member of our genus, of our broader human family, from using tools to wearing clothes to making fire, and maybe outside their cave they've got a little lean-to shelter, we have to imagine. All of that is about manipulating the microenvironment in order to be able to thrive in environments that we as a species have not evolved in. And I would say this kind of change in environment, this desire, this need to modify and that desire to modify is a really defining feature of the human niche. It's something, I mean, sort of by definition, it's where archaeology begins as well. In the archaeological record, the first tools, it's not necessarily the first humans because we have other hominin species beyond our own. But as soon as we see tools, we go outside of paleoanthropology and into archaeology. Whether you agree with that or not, there is different sides of the coin, but I would say it's that ability to be able to manipulate microenvironment and changing the world around us. And that then, of course, can, by extension, kind of tool use to the nth is what is changing our macro environment, if you think about it. That being said, I would say just because it might be natural for us as a species to seek to alter our environments to suit us through our material culture, which is the term that we would use in archaeology, that doesn't mean it's natural for us to seek to degrade or destroy our environments. And indeed, that pattern of behavior is ultimately self-destruction. It's not just the destruction of environments. So yeah, I'm certainly not excusing the damage that contemporary societies have done to our broader environments in the last couple of hundred years.
Okay, thank you. I would generally agree, but I'm interested to hear what Axel thinks about this question as the only non-archaeologist in the group.
I think humans take themselves far too seriously, and I think we may put this also a bit in a bigger context. Of course, there is a discussion about the Anthropocene, and you correctly mentioned, use the word manipulate, Kate. But of course, life on our planet has changed its environment since 2.5 billion years. So the cyanobacteria created oxygen, which then created a whole suite of other processes, triggering enormous evolution on our planet. And of course, Jim Lovelock talked about the Gaia hypothesis, according to which the biosphere is essentially creating its own climate. So we have this interesting co-evolution between life on our planet and climate. And so there is always this interesting effect of the biosphere on the environment. And I just wanted to show some examples here. What you're seeing here is the vegetation change. Maybe you can run it once more over the last, I suppose, 500,000 years. And each of these colors corresponds to a biome. And every once in a while, you can see actually every 20,000 years, the Sahara becomes green. So major vegetation zones, savanna and so on, spread northward. And the interesting thing is, clearly, there is more rainfall. And this is due to the fact that the northern hemisphere summer is closer to the sun every 20,000 years, heating up the northern hemisphere, more rainfall, and that creates more suitable conditions for certain vegetation types. But that's not the whole thing. This is not enough. What we need in order to create a green Sahara, for instance, is the effect of vegetation back on the climate system by evapotranspiration and by changing the albedo, the reflectivity of the land. Without these two processes, where vegetation again feeds back onto the atmosphere, we wouldn't be able to see these green Saharas. And of course, the green Sahara was absolutely important, and maybe you can show the next slide, for humans to settle in that area and live in areas that nowadays would be very harsh. I think that slide disappeared. Never mind. So I think the key point here is that we have the astronomical forcing, that the Milankovitch cycles that change the solar radiation on our planet, that shifts temperatures. With temperature gradients, you're also shifting rainfall bands. These rainfall bands trigger vegetation shifts. These vegetation shifts feed back to the climate system to create a more stable condition for the vegetation. And this can open up or close corridors even for human migration and dispersal. So this is one of many examples, but in general, I would say we always have to think about the biosphere and the climate system kind of in co-evolution. That's a very important concept. So even though I think the original Gaia hypothesis and the Daisy world ideas are very simplified, I think it's a very powerful concept to think about this homeostasis that biospheric processes can actually create in the climate system.
Well, it's certainly a complicated situation. Thank you for that explanation. Sorry about the slide. I think you were getting a little bit ahead of yourself there, Axel, because I believe you were referencing a slide that's coming up in response to our next question, which now that we've decided that humans do change their environments, but lots of things do, let's go on to another common question I get. Catastrophic events in the past and climate change. Were these fact or were these fiction? Axel, I think you're starting us off on this.
Sure.
Oh, my apologies. This was not the slide you meant, but let's riff on it.
I think
Was it this one?
This is fine. So what we of course want to understand is whether there were abrupt climate shifts that really had a massive impact on our human species, maybe on even human evolution, maybe triggering extinction events. Or is it possible that even gradual shifts in the climate system can reach, let's say, tipping points in the human system that are creating unsuitable environments so that humans start to move away or even become extinct? So we addressed this question recently in a collaborative study with colleagues from UCL. What we were interested in was a hiatus in the occupation of Southern Europe, or Europe in general, by Homo erectus. And what you can see on this slide is approximately where early Homo erectus lived. And we have the famous Manishi Homo erectus skulls around 1.8 million years ago. So they managed to get out of Africa maybe around 1.8 to 2 million years ago. And then they seem to thrive in some way in Central and Mediterranean Europe from about 1.6 to 1.2 million years ago. And then suddenly there is this hiatus. And maybe it's because nobody has ever found a skull from that time period, or maybe it's the real thing. And the group later on, maybe Homo antecessor, was supposedly much more clever and maybe much more adapted to the climatic conditions that became actually more dramatic, because that was a time around 900,000 years ago when the ice age cycles became stronger. So now what we found in this study was that looking at a very high resolution sediment core from the Iberian margin of Portugal, that there is an amazing temperature anomaly during so-called marine isotope stage 34, 1.126 million years ago, where the temperatures in the Iberian Peninsula suddenly cooled by about 7 degrees. And this lasted for about 4,000 years. So it was a massive climate event, and you can see that kind of indicated here in the temperature record in the middle. And it just happens to coincide with this interesting hiatus that you see in the occupation. And so suggesting that maybe abrupt climate change was really a trigger for a depopulation event. In order to further study this, we then built a mathematical model, a habitat model that described the climatic niche of Homo erectus. And we were able to see that this climate event, this really unprecedented cooling event, went far off the suitability horizon that this early Homo erectus group was able to build up. So they were not adapted to it, and winter temperatures even in the Mediterranean dropped way below 0 during this event. And we, as far as we know, also Homo erectus at that time was not able to control fire. So it would have been very difficult for them to really survive in this environment. Homo antecessor afterwards was definitely able to cope with glacial conditions. And this tells us something about the climatic effect on human populations in a very dramatic way. Whether, if we think about future climate change will cause a depopulation in certain areas is a very important question that we need to address. Which areas on our planet will become uninhabitable if we don't cut down CO2 emissions? So again, here is the same question in a different context, and for that we will use also climate models as well as habitat suitability models.
Okay, so there's hope. Kate, you were again nodding along a lot during that answer from Axel. Do you want to chime in?
That's a fantastic study, and this idea of sort of interweaving the climate data with these absence of humans in and our hominin ancestors in through time is a really fascinating way of looking at the data and trying to explain presence and absence in the record. And we can also do similar things, but on a sort of a site-based record when we think about how the climate may have restricted or encouraged activity or human presence. And that's something that I've spent a little bit of the last few years looking at. And I think the key thing is we have to remember that these changes, Axel was talking about big, large scale, potentially catastrophic climate changes. But we have to remember that, like I said before, that the climate change is always occurring on that seasonal level. And that seasonal resolution is also what we look for in the archaeological record as well, to be able to understand the lives of those individuals living in the past. And it's very important for archaeologists, both on a seasonal level and a more macro level, to find ways of relating those kind of broad scale changes that Axel was talking about, and maybe also seasonal changes onto the scale of past human lives and experiences. So one of the things, that's definitely one of the things that we seek to do, to take those kinds of records and to relate them to that human scale at archaeological sites. But I think the thing we have to remember as well is that often those records can be hundreds or even thousands of miles away from locations where ice cores are being taken or where sediment cores are being taken, for example. And also, again, those kind of seasonal insights could be I wouldn't say just as drastic, but could be very considerable in terms of whether or not an area was habitable at one point of a year versus another. And that would also shape the sort of seasonal movements and broader biogeographical habits of humans in the past. So this is something that one of my PhD students, Sarah Pedesani, spent a lot of time working on for her work, and was able to generate some really interesting insights into past climate changes. And we were using a method that was based around the faunal remains that we find at archaeological sites. So here we're using something, again, called stable isotope analysis. It's not strontium here, it's oxygen isotope analysis. And here we're analyzing the oxygen isotope variability throughout tooth formation of big animals, big herbivorous animals that have large teeth, like this is a horse tooth you can see depicted here. Now, the enamel in your teeth and in horses' teeth, it forms incrementally. So it's like layers of an onion or tree rings. And that provides a time series of chemical information during which that tooth was formed. So if you like, it's a little year and a half or maybe 1 year of changing chemical fluctuations during that formation period. It's a little time capsule. And when we're looking at oxygen isotopes, we're looking at the water that was consumed by those animals during their tooth formation. Now, through modern studies, we know that the chemistry of local drinking water, so its oxygen isotope ratio, relates to the chemistry of mineralized tissues that form in the animals or even people that drink that water, and that both those things therefore reflect local temperatures. So the oxygen isotope ratio of water is a function of the climate, and you drink that water and you look like the climate in which you're drinking the water. So if we can sequentially sample a horse's tooth that's a year and a half of water inputs, at mid or northern latitudes where you have a strong seasonality, you should see that difference in the drinking water that reflects the changing climate that's reflected in the mineral. Now, the reason why this is exciting, and I want to emphasize, this isn't something to replace those amazing global archives that Axel is talking about. These are to supplement it. But the reason they're exciting is because imagine our horse's tooth here, that exists in the past, in the archaeological record, in our palimpsest, because it was killed and butchered by a human. So if we can get climatic information from that horse, that is relatable to that human level of activity. It's when that site was going on. And this confronts that challenge of relating those broader climate records to individual actions and lives. It allows a very fine scale. And so here is some data you can see. This is from a site in France that we just published, a site called Abri du Marat. And this tells us that around 50,000 years ago, when Neanderthals were living at this site, the seasonality was more pronounced than today. You can see there that the mean annual temperature was pretty similar to how it was today, but summers were warmer, but significantly winters were a lot cooler. So we have an environment, a sort of hyper-seasonality compared to the day in that location. And we can use that as archaeologists to help us interpret Neanderthal activity at that site and to better understand the record we're finding. And at that site, what's interesting in the levels we were working in, that other types of evidence were really only indicating that there were Neanderthal activities going on in spring, summer, and autumn, and perhaps those very cold, that enhanced seasonality might be an explanation for that.
Sounds like a strong hypothesis to me based on that data. Ceren, do you want to chime in with how plants deal with these kinds of situations? Sorry, maybe you're mute. You're still muted.
Can you hear me now? No.
We're having a little bit of technical problem. Give us a second. It was bound to happen at some time.
Good. No.
I can hear you now again.
All right. Okay. Sorry. Right. So, apologies for the little glitch. Right. So I try to think in the work that I do about whether I had any examples of catastrophic or collapse events, and I don't really. So I think part of the reason is because plants are very resilient. That's why I like them. And they are very slow to respond in some cases. So I've got here a small example, and I know they're plots, and they do look boring compared to the previous ones, of what happened in one of these scenarios. And it's kind of an opposite of a collapse event. And I feel like it tells the story of, on a micro scale, of what happens when people are part of this environmental feedback cycle. And it goes back to this idea of looking at the human element, as Kate was highlighting just a second ago. So I've got the plot of vegetation development and how they compare to one of the climatic indicators, in this case, oxygen isotopes, from inland regions of Anatolia. And that's on the left-hand side, and it shows you on the black line, well, on the black filled nice plot, the development through time of oak pollen, of oak woodlands, and they represent pollen cores. So generally, if there's more oaks in the environment, they produce a lot more oak pollen, and it's being deposited in lakes, and we can then recover these and look at their change through time. The oxygen isotope values are showing, and this is the entire sequence from the Holocene, the onset of the period that has a lot more favorable climatic conditions, and that's highlighted in the sort of slightly darker gray area. And I don't know if you can see, but there's about a 2,000 year or so delay in the way the oak woodlands respond in this region. And one of the things that we were looking at as archaeologists working on the archaeological deposited materials that have arrived at sites through the collection of humans is whether people had any role in this, the delay of the environment, and whether they were putting any kind of stress on the situation. So the period that corresponds to that darker gray in the offsite pollen records on the right-hand side plot is also highlighted in darker gray. And as you would see, I hope, because Corycus is very small in that plot, sorry, when there isn't that many oak trees in the broader vegetation, people are not really using that much oak to begin with. So we don't think there was any kind of severe stress on the development of oak woodlands in that region that would have caused such a delay. And in fact, when we started looking at the archaeological materials more closely, we were starting to find a lot of features that are associated with some of the managed woodlands that I showed you live pictures of before. And on the wood anatomy of the charcoals, we were starting to see that people were actually maintaining and managing these resources through time. And around the time when the oak woodlands in the region take off, is also the time when things become very systematically managed in the broader landscape. So we have here a complex study, I guess, of the feedback cycles between what happens in the environment, how slowly some resources can respond or don't necessarily respond at certain times, and the role of humans in that complex relationship, and some of the things that can result in, I guess, the opposite of a collapse scenario, of a more thriving resource. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is great for every single element of that environment, but from the perspective of a community surviving in a marginal environment, we have some examples in archaeology that when we start looking at the individual cases and the individual signatures within these trees, beyond what happens on a macro scale in the globe, we can see some elements of nuance that may allow us to walk away with, I guess, a positive story that we can tell as archaeologists.
And that's really what we're all looking for, right? Thank you, Ceren. That was a really detailed response. Okay, so now to move from the more specific to the broader, the question of climate-induced dispersal. Maybe we can give our audience a little bit of evidence of how climate has made people have to disperse across the globe, both in the past and how it probably will in the future. Axel, do you have something to add about this idea?
Yeah, so I think we can first discuss why climate can become a driver for human dispersal. And I already mentioned there are several possibilities. One is this creation of green corridors. And what you're seeing here is the main three Milankovitch cycles: obliquity, eccentricity, and precession. And as I mentioned earlier, they change the solar radiation on our planet. That changes the heating of the continents and the oceans. And as a result, we will have major shifts in precipitation. And what you're seeing here is a precipitation shift. For instance, during the last 11,000 years, or 11,000 years ago to 9,000 years ago, there is more precipitation in northern Africa, encroaching into the Sahara region, which maintains also vegetation. And the next step is then, as we have more vegetation in a certain area, of course, we also have more fauna coming in. Maybe you can click to the next one. No, well, anyways.
It's coming.
Coming. You have more fauna coming in, and of course humans are very much interested in food, and so using the available net primary productivity essentially as expressed in terms of vegetation and also in terms of mammals. Humans would come together. They would start to perhaps live or exchange, if they come from different areas, exchange also genes. So that's a way of interacting, but also culture is very important. They can exchange culture, and they can also maintain a higher density, population density, because there is more food available. Now, as I mentioned, this Milankovitch forcing has certain time scales, and precessional time scale is 20,000 years. So every 10,000 years, you go from, every 20,000 years, you go from wet, dry, wet. And so in between, we have just the opposite situation, where an area which used to be occupied by humans becomes essentially very dry and can only maintain a small population density. And that can very often lead to migration away from that area, and that could be a trigger also for genetic diversification, because as different groups start to diverge from this area, they will start to also accumulate their own mutations and create their own genetic identity over time. So you can imagine that, let's say, Milankovitch forcing, the effect on the climate system, on vegetation, on food resources, is almost like a metronome of changes in human population size, interactions, cultural exchanges, but also genetic diversification. And could you go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
This one. And there is another effect that we should also consider, and this is apart from the shift in precipitation and temperature, and also under glacial conditions. Of course, we have land ice, so which means the ocean sea level drops down by up to 120 meters during the last glacial maximum. And that, as you can see right now, around 70,000 years ago, that creates these relatively larger or extended continents, the Sahul Shelf, the Sunda Shelf. And this allows essentially humans, early humans, Homo sapiens, and other hominin species during that time to cross corridors that nowadays would be underwater. And I think in a few seconds you will see also the expansion of Homo sapiens into the Americas at a time when the Bering Sea was still a land bridge. So then around 11,000 years ago, the land bridge became again sea. And so this is very important to also understand the effect of glacial cycles on opening and closing these continental migration corridors. And many of the key features, the population of the Americas and the population of Australia, rely essentially on these sea level changes as major migration pathways.
Beautiful image and really detailed discussion. Thank you, Axel. Ceren, I wonder though, how can we see these sorts of pressures on a smaller scale? What about the farming communities that you study?
So I guess one of the more sort of classical ways in which we debate whether climate-induced dispersal or migration is involved in massive changes across the past is what we, I guess, try to understand from looking at the dispersal and spread of farming lifeways or farming communities. And I say "or" here, I guess it could involve people as well as crops and animals moving. It could involve crops and animals moving across space and time. And you will see in this map that I had no part in making, and it is beautiful and available CCBY, everybody, is this, I guess, the scale of not just the geographic spread, but the amount of time it has taken for the dispersal of such lifeways, communities, groups, and their potential cultural transmission. If we still agree that farming started somewhere around the earliest part of the early Holocene, somewhere in a corner of Southwest Asia, not necessarily in one place, but, you know, across a relatively smaller geographic region. We've debated in archaeology, I guess, for the better part of 70, 80 years, whether the onset of agriculture and farming and animal husbandry had any kind of incentive because of climate-induced resource stress. We've come to a stage, I think, of an equilibrium where we say climate and environmental resources probably played some part, but also people and broader biological and evolutionary processes also played other very important parts in the development of this bizarre way of living compared to the great majority of the way we used to live as hunter-gatherers, and many people still do. And then when we try to evaluate why and how these may have spread, we come to periods like the dispersal of farming into inland Anatolia in the 7th millennium, where we have to grapple with whether more or less abrupt events like the 8.2K aridity event had any role to play in people seeking new locations to farm and live in, and then later periods as things started to spread into other regions. But I guess from an archaeological perspective, it's never a certain answer. We certainly see people moving when there's episodes of sea level change into different locations to be able to continue, if they're farming, the farming, or if they're hunter-gathering, then their subsistence practices. So, and that kind of evidence would only come at a very small scale. On the large scale, when we look at the broader picture, we see that people over time familiarize themselves with a much broader set of environments, and may move or spread across space based on a number of complex decisions that occasionally has to do with climate change.
So climate change is definitely not the be all and end all. But in terms of ending things, Kate, did you want to wrap up this question for us? Do you have something to contribute? Kate, sorry, I think you might be muted.
Sorry. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think this sort of brings to mind to me thinking again more about the role that the practice of archaeological investigation can play here, rather than necessarily just kind of the products of archaeology in terms of the findings that we have. And I think we all need to remember as archaeologists that the past is really potent, and engaging with the past through archaeology is a very personal and can be a very personal, empowering thing. So over the last 15 years, I've been part of a team from the University of Aberdeen who have had the privilege of working on an archaeological site in Alaska called Nunalak, as part of a collaborative partnership between the University of Aberdeen and the Village Corporation of Kernootuk Inc. and the people of Quinnahook. So we're all the way up in Western Alaska. Now, for context, in Alaska and all along the Bering Sea, coastlines are being eroded. So villages are losing their airstrips and infrastructure. These are just snippets of press stories that I found online about this. There are whole villages that are facing relocation. The climate is also affecting the predictability of wild foods. And in these areas, wild foods, in parts of the world where imported foods are really prohibitively expensive, these are an important part of the economy, but they're also a way of life, or can be a way of life for many people. Now, due to melting permafrost all along the Bering Sea coast, there is melting permafrost and increasingly unpredictable and aseasonal storms, which are causing the coastline to erode. And one of the things that is getting eroded, that's getting damaged, is actually archaeology. And the archaeological site of Nunalak is actually eroding into the sea, and it's yet another casualty of climate change. Now, the archaeology of Nunalak is just amazing. It has told us so much about life in this part of Alaska hundreds of years ago. You can see all these beautiful objects that have emerged from the permafrost, and that are in a beautiful state of preservation because of that permafrost preservation, all the kinds of organic things that we don't normally find at archaeological sites. So they're telling us about life hundreds of years ago and how the inhabitants of Nunalak coped with their own climate change, because actually they lived during the Little Ice Age, which was a period that Axel mentioned earlier, that period of pre-modern climate change, of climate cooling. But for me, the most important thing I have learned about from this project that isn't the findings, that isn't the archaeological findings, is that the past is truly part of living cultural heritage. And that archaeology serves a purpose in the present in connecting us to our pasts, and that the processes of doing archaeology, of participating in archaeology, can be really empowering as well as fun for people other than just academics. And I think especially in this area and in others, in the face of seemingly unstoppable change from climate change, I think that archaeology can, at least in a very small way, contribute to individual and community resilience in the face of that seemingly unstoppable change.
That's beautiful, Kate. What could be more inspiring than knowing that your own ancestors have survived the Little Ice Age already, right? Thank you so much, guys. Those were wonderful answers. We're going to move on to the question and answer section. And I've got a couple questions ready right here. 1 second. Okay. So one of our YouTube viewers has asked, We have seen changes in climate in the past 2.5 million years, if I understand correctly. We are starting the change from higher than ever. I assume they mean higher temperatures than ever. But wasn't the changes in the past faster than what we are currently going through? Any input on the speed? I think the answer is no, but you're the experts.
Yeah, I think the answer is no on a global scale. Regionally, of course, ICArEHB events in Greenland were extremely fast. You could see 6 degrees Celsius warming in 10 years, but this is not globally. I mean, keep in mind that most of these natural climate phenomena, they have certain patterns where in certain areas they can be quite pronounced, whereas in others they are maybe much more muted. So ICArEHB events that occurred during the last ice age, they were very fast in certain areas, but on a global scale, definitely not as dramatic as what we are doing to the climate system. So we are not only pushing the climate system out of the normal range, but also we are doing it at an unprecedented rate. And not only this, so if we think about CO2, the CO2 rise is unprecedented because we have pretty good CO2 observations, at least for the last 800,000 years, in terms of magnitude, also in terms of rate of change. And that also causes ocean acidification. Part of the CO2 is being taken up by the ocean. And we know from marine sediment cores that the ocean acidification that we are causing right now is probably unprecedented in the context of the last 55 million years. So the answer is definitely no.
Just like most things we do as humans, even our climate change is unprecedented. Yeah. I agree. Thank you, Axel. The next question, should we be actively reversing this terrible current climate change or just stopping it? In other words, would more intervention in CO2 capture or trying for a green Sahara, which is more important? What do you guys think? I think it would be great if we could also reverse it further, but you're the experts.
So maybe I can also respond to that quickly. This sounds a bit, I mean, we are already geoengineering our planet in a strange way, and originally unintentionally, and now the fact that we have all the scientific knowledge available and still we are not reacting means we are essentially intentionally changing our climate system by global warming. Keep in mind, there is no current technology available that will bring the CO2 or the temperature back even to pre-industrial conditions. So we have, with the current technology, already changed our climate system irreversibly. So by cutting down CO2 emissions to zero, what we will do is we will just stabilize the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, which means if we cut down CO2 emissions, we will stabilize the temperature. We won't be able to go down. There's no globally available technology available at this time.
You can't step into the same river twice, right? Anybody else want to add to that one? Okay, well, I do have a question for the zoo archaeologists in the room. Should we be preventing species extinctions, for example, the polar bears, as a result of climate change? We see these repeated extinctions in the past in archaeology. How is this any different? Kate?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I think here it becomes about the causes of the climate change. I think the polar bears, for example, this is a casualty of anthropogenic climate change, and that's what makes it distinct from the kinds of extinctions we've seen in the past. That would be my take on it anyway. I don't know if Axel has anything to add on that.
I mean, polar bears may be the most prolific extinction that is on the horizon in the media and on people's minds. But think about bees. What happens if bees get extinct? Maybe not because of greenhouse warming, but maybe more because of pesticides. Then one of the key pollinators on our planet will disappear. That will probably cause massive food insecurity in future and so on. So I think we should not only think about the polar bears and cuddly other creatures that we think of, but also the very useful creatures on our planet that will most likely be under very heavy anthropogenic stress. So actually, Einstein even wrote a paper about what will happen to the bee extinction, or it's not a paper, but it's somewhere a note. So he had already been thinking about the relevance of bees on our planet. So there are many other important examples where I think we should definitely make sure that we preserve as many species in our system as possible, and not say, okay, we'll just sacrifice some species, even though we don't know really their full ecological value.
Yeah, great point. And a follow-up, I think I know the answer when it comes to bees, but what about reintroducing species that we've already lost? How do you guys feel about that? It's an active area in conservation, and I'm sure it's also something that happens with plant species, right, Ceren? Or is it only animals we reintroduce when they've been lost?
No, I mean, I think I guess the parallel is rewilding landscapes where there's it's complicated. It depends on where and how and when it's done. But I do know this, I guess, and this is potentially true of some animal groups, but for quite a range of plants, especially in marginal or tropical environments, we don't know in some cases what we're losing, because they have never been identified or documented. There's a lot of biodiversity that we're losing as things get worse with the climate, that we don't even know that we're losing them, and we don't even know if they could ever be useful from our perspective or from the perspective of the planet. So I guess we need to do the most that we can to try and yes, reintroduce if we have to, rewild landscapes if we have to, and see that we've exhausted all options to try and preserve some of the diversity that exists on the planet, at least at this moment.
So we have to know what we're losing before we try to reintroduce it. That's a great point. Kate, you were nodding away. Do you have something to add?
I suppose just that we shouldn't conflate the sort of potential reintroduction of species that have been very recently lost to sort of de-extinctions. You know, there's a lot of talk of things like Pleistocene Park and you know, cloning mammoths and what have you, sometimes intermittently in the media. And I suppose that we have to remember that with going back that far, we're dealing with animals that have there's no sort of contemporary environment in the world that's the equivalent of the environments that they're used to, and that we shouldn't confuse those two things. Not that Ceren was doing that, but yeah.
As much as I'd love to see mammoths roaming across Central Europe again, I do not support it as a possibility as a scientist. So moving to things we can support as scientists, how can community archaeology contribute to the understanding of climate change and global warming that is affecting our contemporary communities? Kate, you touched upon this, but perhaps as a group, we could give the audience some action plans and tasks that we could take back to our stakeholders. Do you want to get us started, Kate?
So I was looking at the question above and having a think about that. Oh, no, I'm back. Understand that the climate change and global communities. So I think that community archaeology, I mean, I can only speak from my experience, and really the best people to be speaking about this would also be the communities themselves. And I really want to emphasize that, especially when I'm speaking about the work in Alaska that I'm a very minor part of. And really the best people to speak about that would be the communities themselves. But certainly community archaeology can highlight the sort of understanding of climate change in the past, the plight of climate change in the present. Like I said, archaeology is very much another victim of climate change, one of many victims of climate change. I think one of another area, if we're talking specifically about, so for example, I'm trying to think of action plans now to take on this task. I think another area, but it's less to do with community archaeology and more to do with Indigenous knowledge and learning, is I think that's something that climate change literature as a whole hasn't really taken on board, but how to include those things into climate change action plans. Again, I don't know, maybe Axel has some views on this. Sorry, that was a rather garbled answer, wasn't it?
No, it was great. It's a complex question. There's a lot that we want to do, and there's restrictions on what we can do as well. But yeah,
and
anybody else have anything to add? Community engagement?
And I was going to say that it also really depends on the community as well, and which communities we're talking about, which can be quite specific. I don't know if I'm allowed to reference one of the questions further up, or should we get to it in order?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I was trying to think of one of the questions in the chat was about how climate change can make archaeology real, and I was trying to hot foot with an example of that. And one of the best examples I could think of, it's not quite climate change, but I guess it is environmental change or environmental action, is if you think about catastrophic volcanic events and learning about them in the past and how they may have happened, and the temperature of the volcano reached, the spread of the the fallout or what have you. But then you look at the archaeology of Pompeii, right? And you look at those individual lives, those moments in plight. It's the archaeology of that makes the theory of the thing that happened real. And I suppose that's what I was getting at before when I was trying to make this idea that archaeology makes it real. We tell stories about humans and how they endured things, and those things can feel remote and feel different. Climate, environmental change, catastrophic volcanism events. Yeah, so I think that's where because archaeology involves people and it's for people today, and that's why it can be so potent and useful in these scenarios, or at least just a catalyst. So even if itself cannot serve, it can serve as a vehicle for discourse, because it involves people in the past and the present, because there's the doers of archaeology as well as the subject of archaeology.
Yeah, really great point. I love to hear all of us talk so much about the narrative that archaeologists create, which I think sometimes gets lost in the hustle and bustle to publish or perish and to have the best data and the best science. But we are telling stories about people in the past. And that's a really important and influential thing. So thank you all for telling your stories today to us. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up at this point, but I want to thank all three of our expert speakers for their thoughtful points and for taking the time to share their expertise in both climate science and prehistory with us today. I think we did a pretty good job at finding the intersection between the two and having a few things to talk about. If anyone in the audience is interested in learning a bit more about the research that our three experts are doing, you can follow the QR links here or follow them on their Twitter and other web pages. For more information about dialogues itself from ICAREHB, you can always visit our website, www.icarehb.com/dialogues. And lastly, don't forget to join us for our next dialogue event, which will be happening in spring 2024. So this ICAREHB Dialogues will follow the same format as this current one. So we'll be inviting our own researcher, Dr. Maria Ana Correa, to join us and discuss with two expert outsider researchers about women in prehistory. So follow us on your favorite social media. We've got pretty much all of them, and you'll get the details and you'll get the chance to register. But I want to thank again Dr. Kabukcu, Professor Axel Timmermann, and Professor Kate Britton for joining us today. And I want to thank the audience for taking the time out to join us as well. I hope that we'll see you all next time and we can continue our dialogue. Okay, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks again, team. Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Sorry for the echo. Sorry.
Are we offline now?
That was great.